Дамы и господа, президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Путин.
The Kremlin's Chechen strongman allegedly gets infected, adding to the list of top Russian officials afflicted with COVID-19. Russia postpones both the draft and upcoming military exercises. And amid increased scrutiny that Russia is cooking the numbers on coronavirus infections and deaths, a new report by Novaya Gazeta alleges a widespread campaign in Russia's regions to suppress information about the virus. Our coverage of Russia in the time of coronavirus continues. We've got a lot to talk about, so let's get talking. Hello from my makeshift studio in my home in our nation's capital's lovely Adams Morgan neighborhood, where I am observing federal and local social distancing guidelines, and welcome to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. And in case anybody is counting, this is our 10th episode from our not-so-splendid isolation, and it's been 10 weeks since I've had a haircut. Joining me from his home in Alexandria, Virginia, where they tell me there is an awesome old town, is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Don.
Hi, guys. Bright. Great to be back.
Good to have you back. Also joining us from just down the street from me in Washington's beautiful DuPont Circle neighborhood is Maria Snegovaya, a fellow with SIPA's Russia program and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you for having me, Brian.
Thank you for being here. So we got a lot of different disparate things here. Kind of got a Moscow coronavirus miscellaneous show today. So let's start with Kadyrov. Let's start with Ramzan Kadyrov. On Thursday, news broke that Kadyrov was suspected of being infected with COVID-19 and was being hospitalized in Moscow. Just for the record, this has not been confirmed as we are recording, although it's been widely reported in Russia, and Kadyrov has not been seen in public for at least 24 hours as we are recording. If Kadyrov is indeed infected, he would join Putin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, his first deputy chief of staff Sergei Kiriyenko, his prime minister Mikhail Mishustin, culture minister Olga Lubimova, science and education minister Valery Falkov, and construction minister Vladimir Yakushev. The list keeps getting longer and longer. But given Kadyrov's unique position and the perception that stability in Chechnya is largely dependent upon him, this could turn out to be the most destabilizing infection of all if it turns out to be true. My old Power Vertical Podcast co-host Mark Eliade had a very interesting piece about this today that I sent around to everybody, and I recommend everybody read. Mark is always as insightful as always on this. Your thoughts on this, Don, Maria? I mean, the perception about Kadyrov, either correctly or incorrectly, as Mark points out in his article, is that in the Kremlin, he is viewed as indispensable because the perception is that removing him from the scene could lead to instability in Chechnya. Now, Mark points out that this may not really truly be the case because you may be able to essentially pay somebody else off to keep Chechnya in line, and there's nothing unique about Kadyrov in this sense. And it might even be somebody who's less troublesome and mercurial and unpredictable than Kadyrov that would actually probably be to the Kremlin's liking, but the perception is there. Maria, Don, your thoughts on the Kadyrov and the potential that Kadyrov is infected? How potentially destabilizing is this? Is it the most destabilizing potential infection of all, excluding, of course, if Putin were to be infected? Maria, you're nodding.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, actually, I wanted to start by drawing interesting parallels that in Russia, but also worldwide, the coronavirus seems to disproportionately affect the more traditional sort of tribal community, if you wish. It's not just Chechnya. In Russia, for example, last week, there were huge infections reported from Adygea. It's another Caucasian republic where people just en masse went to funerals and 500 people of them, about 150 people got infected. So it's just interesting parallel that Chechnya just being another example of this more traditional community, as is Russian Orthodox Church. By the way, they face trouble sort of abandoning their traditional communal large-scale gatherings, and as a result, we see high rates of infections cross-wide. Same with soccer fan community as well in Russia and in Italy, etc., etc. This has been pointed out by Russia's political scientist Sergei Medvedev, among others. But when it comes to Kadyrov, he's just another representation of the same trend, where he actually did introduce a very strict quarantine regime, as Mark Galotti very correctly points out, but he also violated his own quarantine regime repeatedly, and has been said to, go around the Republic, hugging people, meeting people, and hence the outcome. By the way, on the whole image of Kadyrov as a strongman, it's true, but it's not the first time he gets sick. Interestingly enough, the actually Caucasian media, the Caucasian Knot, has estimated that in the last 11 months before coronavirus infection emerged, Kadyrov has been reported to get sick 3 times. So he actually has been facing some issues apparently with his sickness. It's not the first time. But finally, to answer your question, Brian, yes, I absolutely agree that here, in this case, the risks are for destabilizing Putin's system are very big. That's because, of course, Putin, in some sense, is Kadyrov. His first coming to power, his legitimation of this strongman system, of the personalistic system, are all based on his quote-unquote victory in the Second Chechen War, right? Which, as the outcome, Kadyrov emerged, and as troublemaker as he was, as you, Brian, correctly pointed out, he also definitely did instill this very questionable but nonetheless order in Chechnya, and there was no war between Chechnya and Russia since, despite all these repeated violations of human rights and whatnot happening within Chechnya. It's also important to remember that, of course, despite the fact that Russia is a unitary state, Chechnya really largely operates on its own rules and laws. It really has a totalitarian system. I know many, pundits out there like to describe Putin's regime as totalitarian, but in fact, it's quite relatively even soft, hardening authoritarian system. But where you really find totalitarianism in Russia is Kadyrov's Chechnya. And it's really, people are prosecuted for harshly for very, very minor violations. People are afraid to speak up publicly against Kadyrov, and even outside of Kadyrov's Chechnya, criticizing Kadyrov really may cost you life. It's interesting that Putin's system tolerates this situation despite these authoritarian tendencies within Putin's own system. He tolerates this sort of separate order existing inside of Chechnya, but even more importantly, for the rest of Russia, the Chechen order tends to spill over outside of Chechen boundaries and sort of impact Russia as well. For example, in the during the elections, the violations and the falsifications are reportedly the highest, specifically in republics like Chechnya, where, of course, the Putin's support and United Russia support commonly reaches 90% levels. And that, of course, is in the long run ends up influencing the rest of Russia, where essentially this imposed order reinforces Putin's rule in one way or another. So Kadyrov, in this sense, is really indispensable to the system, and his living, potential something happening to him definitely threatens a lot of destabilization of Chechnya and of Putin's rule as well, especially given how unstable the relationship between Russia and Chechnya has been historically.
No, I mean, it is ironic. I mean, the Chechnya is de facto independent, but Russia's paying for it, as Mark correctly points out. And yeah, Kadyrov initially dismissed COVID-19, then swung to the opposite direction, threatening the death penalty for anybody that violated quarantines. According to some posts on Telegram, he apparently was infected, reportedly 2 to 3 weeks ago, when he visited the Rus-Martinovskoye region, the district of Chechnya, and he has been pretty much ignoring social distancing. And Mark points out in his what do we got here?
Sorry.
That's right. Mark points out in his article that there are people who could conceivably replace him. Magomed Daudov, for example, or Adam Delimkhanov are two possibilities. And Mark seems to think that the Kremlin could find somebody who could fill those Kadyrov shoes quite easily. It's just a matter of paying them off, giving them carte blanche, and letting them know where the boundaries are. But the perception in the Kremlin of Kadyrov, the centrality of Kadyrov and the fears of a third Chechen war, I think could lead the Kremlin to do something rash in this situation. Just thinking this through out loud. Don, what do you think? We were both in Moscow for the first and second Chechen wars of.
Yeah, it's a tantalizing problem. Again, I would say that, first of all, preliminarily, that the virus has shown, I think, a more fragile, and I use that word guardedly, fragile leadership hold over the country, and also Kadyrov is a microcosm of the problem. I think it may not be at the top as sturdy as we had all assumed it might be. I think Kadyrov departure, and I like Mark's article very much, would be very, very, very dangerous for the Kremlin, because you're talking a huge amount of money. I don't think any of those, I don't want to say non-entities, Brian, but those people he named could do anywhere near the job that Kadyrov has done. And we tend to he goes back in the shadows periodically. We tend, I think, maybe overlook him as a force in the system, but I think he very much is. I think it's, you emphasized correctly the Kremlin perception, but I think it may be the reality, Mark and Maria, it may be the reality too, because, you and I who lived there in the 90s, Brian, we saw the arrogance with which the Russian military went down there. We saw them have the trouble they did, and it was only really brutality and money, the Putin way of governing that pacify the situation. I'm not sure that could be done without spreading to other ailments in the system, which we've talked about in the past 9 or 10 weeks. So I think it's a real problem. I think they have to be very careful, and he ought to get the best doctors in Moscow he can this weekend, because it's a problem.
No, we can be assured that he's getting the best medical care that he can possibly get.
Mark's description of the car motorcades going.
Yes. I mean, but Don, remember, and I believe we were both at RFERL at the time when Kadyrov was named the president of Chechnya, and he was only known because of his father, Ahmad Kadyrov.
Yes.
There were doubts at that time, I remember very distinctly, as to whether Ramzan Kadyrov was, a kid at the time. I mean, not a kid, but he was a very young adult. Whether he was up to the challenge. And he's turned out to be mercurial, childish, dangerous, impulsive, but he has been effective at kind of controlling that territory, which is Moscow's main objective.
Brian, imagine if some variant of that kind of war broke out again, that went on for a while, that Russian boys come home in body bags. It's not what Putin needs right now.
And this fear is going to drive it.
Exactly. So we'll see, but it's very dangerous.
Plus, Russia, I'm not sure, has the bandwidth for a Chechen war right now. Given all of its other, and we're going to talk a bit about the military in the second part, given other constraints on the military which are emerging. Okay, second topic for today. This kind of is related to something I wrote on SIPA's Common Crisis platform earlier this week. I wrote a piece called "The Kremlin's Numbers Racket," that basically looked at, initially, it looked like Russia's infections were really low. Then it turns out they weren't so low, because all those pneumonia cases that were getting reported but weren't being recorded as coronavirus cases. So the infection rate went up, but the death rate remained just remarkably low. And now, surprise, surprise, that is shown to be false as well. The Moscow city government's very own statistics are showing that the deaths in April of 2020 are 1,700 more, or about 3 times higher than they were for any other April over the past 5 years, or the average of the last 5 Aprils. So that suggests the death toll, Russia's death toll, could be 3 times higher than it has been officially reported. A Kremlin strategy document in terms of how to protect Putin's image during the coronavirus pandemic said to stress Russia's low death toll, and that this is a product of reforms Putin has done on the healthcare system. Anybody that's been following the healthcare debate in Russia can only find that laughable, but that is what the Kremlin wanted to push, which explains why they reacted so hysterically when the New York Times and the Financial Times published articles that expose this. Now, Novaya Gazeta comes out with a report this week that the Prosecutor General's Office, Roskomnadzor, and regional health ministries have been cracking down on what they are calling fake news about the coronavirus pandemic. In other words, anything the Kremlin doesn't want to hear about the pandemic in the regions. So again, we're getting more, this very interesting notion that the Kremlin's propaganda machine has met its match in a lot of ways with this pandemic. At least this is my working hypothesis moving forward. Because it's one thing to put out propaganda, spewing out lies that Ukraine is ruled by fascists or the like. And it's another to put something out about a pandemic when people's brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, neighbors, friends are all getting sick and in a lot of cases dying. It's a harder sell propaganda-wise. So again, this report in Novaya Gazeta just comes right on the heels of something I've been tracking really closely, and that is the repeated failures of Russia's propaganda machine about the COVID-19 virus domestically in Russia. Maria, your thoughts on this? What do you think? I mean, am I being overly optimistic? Is not the right choice of words, but am I overestimating the degree to which Russia's propaganda machine is kind of meeting its match in this pandemic?
Thank you, Brian. By the way, just wanted to follow up with some hilarious numbers in how Russian officials falsified the statistics, which even kind of made the Russian statisticians scratch their head. Do they really think we're idiots? For example, on May 17th, Boris Ovchinnikov, who is a Russian statistician who follows the data really closely, says that almost every 10th Russian regions in the last day reported the increase in the number of infected at 98 or 97 people, like sharp, every 10th region. So, and he says in his post, like, are they really making fun of us? Or is it possible they're signaling us? It's some kind of Morse code. We are imprisoners of the Kremlin's, falsification orders. Hey, don't trust these numbers. Or alternatively, similarly, another Russian analyst has shown that, as a matter of fact, the Russian statistics tends to fluctuate in the region. Tatiana Mikhailova from Russian Academy of Science, she shows that the Russian regions report the data where the numbers in infected increase either in the regional capital or in the rest of the region on the day-to-day basis, but never together. And so the result is more or less flattened number of people who get infected because they fluctuate either in the capital or in the region. Again, just another illustration that this is absolutely fake data that really hardly tells us anything. The only reliable assumptions may be made on these excessive deaths. By the way, summing up not just, of course, officially reported coronavirus deaths, but all the deaths. Probably after some time, we'll know how many people actually died. The rates of infections are totally fake. But at the same time, to answer your question, Brian, the rest of the Russian population doesn't seem to care as much because, as we have discussed repeatedly in the past, the real problems that Russians are concerned with is mainly, quote unquote, modernizing society, so to speak. So societies that have not yet reached a certain development level of well-being. they are primarily concerned with the economic situation. There was this film poll. I do understand that film data is very questionable, but at the same time, this is actually this. This is in line with my own experience talking to the Russian people, is that about 61% of the Russian population thinks that the risks of getting infected with the virus is low or rather low, 61%. Again, that means that majority of people are really not worried. Many people also couldn't answer. Only so 40% said it's very low, 39% couldn't answer, and only 21% of the people actually said that there is rather high high risks to get infected with coronavirus. In other words, this very relative. Only every fifth person is concerned. Also, given the fact that
Marie, sorry to interrupt. I mean, that's not inconsistent with data you see elsewhere. I mean, people are very worried about the coronavirus, but they are less worried about getting infected themselves than the broader impact it's having on society. Those statistics are not inconsistent with numbers you'd see in even Western democratic countries.
But there were other data, Brian. There was other data by Levada Center, for example, that has shown, and thank you for that important point, but there was other data that's shown again that the Russians view economic factors much more important than specifically the infection or even personal death. Honestly, if you are struggling with so much, I guess, dying is like not such a high on the list of priorities. And in this sense, I think that the Kremlin will be relatively successful in achieving its goals, primarily because of the control over the communication means. Second, because the real data on coronavirus infections are nowhere to be found. It's like whatever official is reported has zero. It's already clear at this point. There's zero relationship to reality whatsoever. And third, of course, that's because Russians sort of want to believe that, right? Because they like the coronavirus is on top of everything else you have to deal with is really relatively smaller concern, and that will probably resonate with what they'd like to believe. As usual, of course, the most aware, the most politically informed social groups, they will be concerned, but that population group essentially at this point is excluded from the electoral process because of all these amendments. As a matter of fact, a friend of mine whose political views are oppositionary in opposition to Putin, he was the head of one of the electoral commissions lately, and he actually wrote me that he thinks about just giving up because he doesn't see really any point right now to go at the elections now that none of the opposition leaders or none of the opposition candidate will ever be allowed to run, and the same with the constitutional amendments. So in this, as usual, de facto, the Kremlin excludes and demobilizes the most opposition groups. The only point of concern for the Kremlin where I wanted to point out is in our recent Levada survey, in the report we are hoping to publish next week, actually, we find that among all of the rights that Russians report being violated, experience being violated in the country, they actually put the right to medical service on top. About 20% of our respondents said that. So from this perspective, and the very fact that Russians are generally much more concerned about the social rights as right to medicine, is this might potentially create certain risks for the Kremlin in the future, especially as many more people will encounter the dire situation in the medical system these days as they get infected with the virus.
I mean, with the Russian healthcare system overstretched to capacity right now, you have to wonder if that is going to become a danger. I mean, what I found interesting about the Novaya Gazeta piece, which was written by Ivan Gilin, who's a very good Russian journalist, is that it was all focused on the regions. In Ufa, for example, media outlets were forced to remove articles about cemeteries related to COVID-19. The editor of the website 66.ru in Sverdlovsk was sued by that region's health minister for reporting information about the pandemic. And this tells me that, I mean, initially this was a Moscow problem. Most of the reported cases were in Moscow. The perception in Russia was that it was a Moscow problem. Very much like here in the US, initially it was seen as a New York problem. right? But I mean, viruses do not remain confined to, urban metropolitan areas. They break out first in urban metropolitan areas because of the population density, but eventually they spread everywhere. And just like as was the case in the US, where COVID is now hitting the heartland, it's also going to hit the Russian provinces. This is happening now, and this, I think, has got to be making the Kremlin nervous. As long as this was a problem confined to Moscow, it wasn't that big. It probably wasn't that big of a political problem. Don, what do you think?
Yeah, a couple comments. Very interesting discussion. What you see here is sort of the playing out, guys, that we've seen in other countries, which is the trade-off between the need to work and keep the economy going, and that's seems to be here in the U.S. even more of a concern of working people, and the broader public health issues. And we see this playing out in a little bit different way in Russia, but still very interestingly, as Maria just pointed out. Actually, I give a lot of credit to the Russian people for not believing a lot of the propaganda and disinformation. They've seen a lot of it before in other areas, and perhaps this would remind us that there are limits to the extent to which this kind of thing could work. And finally, Maria, I always think as I'm walking down my secluded street here, you always say that life is cheaper in Russia in the esteem of a lot of people. And I think maybe they're more willing to take risks even as they're disturbed by what's going on and the spread of the disease.
I'm always bothered by this dichotomy between the economic issues and the public health issues.
Yeah, me too.
You cannot address the economic issues without addressing the public health issues. You have to address the public health matter first before you can truly address the economic issues. Because as Brian, not going to congregate close to each other, it's going to be business everywhere, right?
Well, the debate here in the States is just that. But a lot of people reverse the order. Who are these coastal elites? Tell us not to go to work. We've got to support our family. And you get a different answer in Missouri.
Yeah, I think I always saw that as a false framing of it.
Yeah.
Because, a lot of what we're seeing is that you're seeing some people venture out as different states open up, but you're also seeing a lot of people who are still afraid to go to work as states open up. So, and people are going to eventually vote with their feet. The economy is not going to recover, whether we're talking about Russia or the United States. It's not going to recover fully until people feel safe going to work. It's just that simple. We can all think of our own situations right now. When will I feel comfortable again getting in an Uber and, cruising down 16th Street to our office and going into a big office high rise with hundreds and hundreds of people touching things that other people are touching. That to me is not going to be determined by what the DC authorities say. It's going to be like, when do I feel like.
But Brian, I agree with you.
I think Russians are the same.
Yeah, I agree with you, period. But this gets into a lot of social and political perceptions about who's giving the orders. And a lot of people in Arkansas or Rostov just don't trust the authorities. They have their own decisions to make, and they're willing to take the risk. And that's always been the tension in this crisis for the past several months. And I side with you in the need for public health first, but I understand the other point of view.
No, my working hypothesis about this, as far as Russia is concerned, is that this is a tougher propaganda sell for the Kremlin than previous things. Maybe it's overstating it to say the Kremlin's propaganda machine has met its match with a virus that can't be gaslighted and spun and bullied and bribed. And maybe I'm overstating it there, but it does seem that this is just a much, much tougher sell for them. And I'm willing to be proven wrong going forward. I've been proven wrong in the past, but that's how I'm looking at it. Right? Go ahead, Maria.
I would just add the fact that Russia is very unequal, right, in the way political awareness is spread. And what you're saying is definitely true of Moscow and St. Petersburg, but not necessarily true of the rest of Russia, which is much more rural, much less reliant on internet for information. And when in the first place, very few, not as many places have introduced this full quarantine situation. So Moscow response has been much, much tougher than most of Russia. So in this sense, we need to keep in mind that we are talking here about Moscow and St. Petersburg, but these are the cities that are already de facto lost for the Kremlin, at least when it comes to the younger, more vibrant, more dynamic part of this population. But when it comes to the regions where it is where the Kremlin's electorates reside, I think they have a slightly different understanding of the risks. And of course, just to keep in mind, Russia's suicidal rates, right, are relatively high. That's just to keep in mind when talking about the importance of human life for Russians. Unfortunately, the suicide rates, they have been in decline, but still not as low as we'd like them to see. And they kind of reflect how people feel,
And they seem to be rising among healthcare workers right now, which could at some point be the subject of an entire program.
Brian, could I?
Yeah, sure.
Could I push the discussion in a little different direction back to Maria's opening comment about tribalism and ask you both a question? Is there something tribal about the Russian? I know what she's going to say, but I'll ask Maria anyway. Is there something tribal about the Russian elite that so many people appear to have been affected? Or, and I know the answer, but go ahead, I'm giving you a softball to hit. Is this more than in other countries? It seems like it, but again, I can't do a regression on it. But we always talk about the elite being separate from the masses, and
it does.
yeah, it does.
A couple of infections within the White House staff got us freaking out here in Washington.
A
couple of Congress members of Congress. And a senator or two, but we're talking the prime minister, we're talking about the deputy chief of staff of the Kremlin, we're talking about the press secretary, and we're talking about Kadyrov and three other ministers. You're right. I do think the Russian elite is very tribal. In fact, it's made up of.
Well, I saw one wag talk about they all got it on the same yacht in the Mediterranean. But.
I'll defer to Maria on this one.
Thank you. Well, last time we discussed it, and I actually think here the reasons are a little bit different from tribalism, even if I'd love to incorporate that explanation somehow. And that's primarily has to do with the fact that New York is the city that was hit hardest in the United States, primarily for the same reason as the Russian elites were. They are much more likely to travel outside, they're much more in the sense open, and honestly, frankly, they seem to reside and spend the time outside of Russia, and primarily in Italy and France, the two countries which were disproportionately hit by the coronavirus pandemic in the early days, especially the Courchevel. And the Russian elites are known to organize these parties in Courchevel and the Alps and other places, and in Moscow, and they actually have been infecting each other. These are relatively narrow circles where the reports of early infection actually started with actors and singers, all of whom we really kind of communicate with the Russian elites throughout these private parties, and this got spread around. Of course, also the very fact that the Russian elites don't follow their own orders, even Kadyrov, they don't follow the orders they issue. That's another factor that's played into this game.
You Moscow and New York, the comparison is apt. New York is the gateway to America for most people. Except for us, we arrive in America, and when we come back to America, we arrive at Dulles International Airport because we live in our nation's capital. But most people that enter the United States from Europe, and that is where most of the cases actually came from China to Europe and Europe to the United States, they enter through New York. And then New York has, of course, the largest population density of any American city, and therefore this is where viruses spread, right? Moscow is the point of entry when you enter Russia. Most people that enter the Russian Federation from abroad by air enter in Moscow. Moscow has a population of 12 million, which makes it an incubator of viruses, but then that's going to spread outward. Now, the Russian elite is interesting. Have they been practicing social distancing? Have they been being responsible? How tight are the quarters that they're in? There was a lot of talk about...
Brian, maybe they got it in New York.
perhaps, or in Europe. I mean, there was a lot of talk on U.S. media about how, despite the perception of like the West Wing in the White House, that it's this vast area, it is actually quite cramped, is what everybody that's ever worked in the West Wing says. I don't know if, the extent to which, the Kremlin administration, how cramped those quarters are, and how, in what kind of close proximity different people working in the Kremlin administration or in the Russian government, in the Russian White House, are, how close cramped quarters. I mean, with Kadyrov, we basically know he was flouting social distancing, traveling around Chechnya, shaking hands, and basically being Kadyrov. And so it's not really terribly surprising. In terms of the rest of the Russian elite, they all do live in Moscow, which is a cramped thing. Now, they ain't riding the metro, right? They're getting driven around with blue bucket sirens on their roofs, their cars, but yet they are in a city of 12 million people. And you cannot not come into contact with people. So it's an interesting question to look at going forward. I am fascinated by this issue of how well Russia's propaganda is going to work going forward on this. I want to shift gears now. In a few moments, we will continue our discussion and look at the pandemic's influence on Russian foreign affairs. I'd like to remind you, you are listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, Director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Join me from his home in Alexandria, Virginia, where, yes, Virginia, there is an awesome old town, is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Also joining us just down the street from me in Washington's beautiful DuPont Circle neighborhood is Maria Snegovaya, a fellow at SIPA's Russia program and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. I'd also like to remind you can subscribe to the Power Vertical Podcast on iTunes. You can read the Power Vertical blog and watch the vertical video at sipa.org, and you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. So Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said on Tuesday that Russia is not planning to carry out any military exercises along its border with NATO member countries in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. I was approached by journalists for comment about this, and this is my hot take. First of all, pay attention to what Russia does, not what Sergei Lavrov says. The man is paid to lie for a revanchist, kleptocratic regime. In my view, he is effectively the functional equivalent of a mafia lawyer. So you should take Kadyrov's words with the same seriousness you would take a mafia lawyer's words when he says, "Your Honor, my client is just a respectable businessman." That said, COVID-19 has harmed Russia's military capabilities. Russia's delayed the military draft, which was supposed to start on April 1st due to the pandemic. All conscripts are to be tested for COVID-19 and possibly placed in 2-week quarantine, further delaying deployments. Moreover, given widespread suspicions that Russia's actual infection rate is higher than the officially reported figures, as we discussed in the first half, it would be fair to assume that infections in the armed forces exceed the roughly 1,600 to 1,700 that have been reported by the Defense Ministry thus far. So there appears to be a general manpower issue. Don, Maria, your thoughts on Lavrov's announcements? Is Lavrov trying to generate goodwill for something Russia may have had to do anyway? I expect Russia to be forced to have a kind of temporary retrenchment due to all of this. I don't think it's going to change Russia's overall military posture, goals, and strategies at all, but in the short run, they seem to have to do this. What are your thoughts on this, and on the draft being postponed and the effects of that?
I thought it was one of the most interesting things of the week, and I'm glad you brought it up now. I think it's very interesting. It's certainly as he said, I believe him. Although I think the Robert Duvall character in The Godfather is better looking.
Yeah, Tom Hagen is. Tom Hagen is.
A couple points.
Love's got nothing on him.
It's important to find out, and I think it's much too early, whether these effects are, as you said, short-term and transient or long-term. And I think it's too early to tell. I think it's likely to be short-term, and the larger erosion of military capability, if that's what we're looking at, will be from economic and other problems. But it's too early to tell because, you and I have talked about Ben Hodges always saying, watch the exercises. Let's see what happens 6 months down the road.
Yeah.
The other point I would make is that there's a lot of evidence that in their adventures overseas, Venezuela and Libya in particular, there is at least as high of Russian activity, but those are much cheaper and those are probably easier to sustain. But let's take this very interesting thing Lavar said and or Tom said, and then let's see how it is down the road at the next round of military exercises, or cutting back fuel for the Navy or stuff like that. It has to be a long-term trend, not just a reaction to an unfortunate couple of months, I would say.
What do you see? I mean, how do you see the delay of the draft affect?
Same thing.
There's a manpower issue.
It is. But if those boys, and likely the overwhelming majority of those boys, will be better in 6 months, they could be picked up next time. I think that the Army, which is in any case smaller than it has been, can probably afford a postponement. But let's see when they go ahead. That's the interesting.
If you can't have basketball games, how the hell do you have military exercises with social distancing?
Exactly.
Unless you just really don't care about the lives of your soldiers.
Exactly. And remember,
which may be the case, but then you're going to exacerbate your manpower problems.
Yeah.
It's going to be, unless they start just doing tabletop exercises, but that wouldn't have near the psyop and propaganda value that actual exercise. Maria,
so we have to see. Remember, we saw the same problem with the practice for the Victory Day a month ago.
Yes, exactly. Maria?
First of all, I agree that the numbers are, of course, absolutely not to be trusted. In early May, already, coronavirus was discovered among about 1,200 military officers, as well as or military people in the military, as well as.
And the latest numbers I saw are just under 1,700, which is absurdly low.
And about 1,200 military students in the military university, so it's actually already way above 2,000, and they're actually saying officially there is fewer infected. But it's just the very important element of it is also remember that the preparation for the military parade from May 9th continued throughout the early stages of the pandemic, which actually increased the infection among the military even further. Most importantly, we haven't yet raised the very important news that came out last week, that the Kremlin still now plans allegedly to set this, the plebiscite, the referendum to vote for the constitutional amendments at the same day when they will run the military parade, which they delayed because of May 9th, on June 24th right now. This has been leaked as secret, discussions within Kremlin, and they also already started delegating the funds for it according to these different sources. That the reason why they picked June 24th, is when the military parade was also run in 1945 by Stalin. The advantages of this approach, of course, is the fact that generally summer is not preferable for any kind of electoral activity, because most people on weekends, when election typically takes place, leave Moscow, leave cities and go outside to their dachas. Here they will do this artificial military parade in the middle of the week on Wednesday, and under pretext of this military parade, they will make it a holiday, a day off, and simultaneously make it the day when people will vote for Putin, to approve this constitutional amendments. Again, in this unity, uniting against this Victory Day. Again, the whole idea of the Second World War being one of the biggest legitimacy factors for Putin, interestingly enough, even if he did not really take part in that war. So in this sense, again, this is all a very relatively clear political estimate, calculus. We see Kremlin preparing for it. But of course, given the fact that, and linking this to our earlier discussion, in reality, coronavirus pandemic will not be defeated by then. And of course, from this position, if the military parade in the March takes place in mid-June, we're likely to see even high infection rates among the Russian military.
Okay, and we'll again continue to keep an eye on this going forward. And finally, in some non-COVID news, but something I could not talk about this week, the United States says it plans to pull out of the 2002 Open Skies Treaty because Russia will not allow U.S. overflights over Kaliningrad near Georgia. The Russian Foreign Ministry called this a blow to European security. I must add, some of the NATO allies are also not terribly happy about this. It's unclear if this is a ploy. I know that the United States is justifiably upset that Russia is violating the treaty by not allowing overflights of Kaliningrad, which Russia is clearly militarizing, and different other parts of Russia near the Republic of Georgia, where we also see a lot of militarization going on in the Black Sea area. The Open Skies Treaty, of course, was signed in 2002, but negotiations for it began back in '89. And it's a treaty that allowed, it was initially being negotiated between the Soviet Union and the United States, but it was allowed overflights to kind of create reassurance that military activity was not going on. This was a Cold War relic that is still in existence and actually quite relevant today. Don, if I'm not mistaken, you were at State when this treaty was being negotiated between '89 and 2002. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, we've pulled out of the INF treaty. It looks like we're pulling out of Open Skies, and there's a lot of thought that maybe a New START may be next on the menu.
For me, yeah, I gave a couple interviews on this to the media this week, Brian. I think that this treaty was always sort of never fully implemented, particularly on the Russian side, and I know the U.S. has had a lot of concerns about just what you said, Kaliningrad and other areas where they simply were not allowed to exercise their treaty rights. But for me, the major issue is, does this indicate a Trump administration reluctance to extend the strategic treaty next February? Because
right.
I think, Brian, this is the second or third treaty they pulled out of: Iran, INF, and this one.
So third overall, but the second relating to Russia.
Yeah, and a lot of people think that they are not going to renew the strategic treaty next February 5th without the Chinese in there, and the Chinese have no intention of entering this.
And the Russians don't want the Chinese in there either.
Exactly. Yeah. So
I long thought the next round of arms control treaties would have to bring in not just Russia and the United States, but other powers as well. Most notably.
Yeah, and I think that's the administration position, and you can agree or disagree, but it's we're at a critical point now on that thing.
Maria, your thoughts as we...
Well, I'm glad that, in some ways, I'm glad that the U.S. kind of backs down from the attempts to reset, but rather takes a more assertive posture vis-a-vis Russia, especially as far as I understand that the U.S. has an advantage in using its satellite network if it wanted to monitor the Russia's actually plane activity. So in this sense, I definitely welcome this development in the sense that I think it indicates the right kind of a more updated understanding of what the kind of risks that the Kremlin regime represents to the West. However, as far as I understand, the step was relatively unilateral on this side of the Trump administration without consultations with the European allies.
Yes.
And this is what worries me a little bit, since we do already see the fractures, of course, emerging among in the transatlantic alliances. That's hardly a new point, and further weakening it or like raising these concerns among the European allies, it is not something that I think is correct. So hopefully that will be overcome in the future at some point.
Yeah, I agree with you, Maria, about consulting the European allies. I mean, to quote our good friend and colleague, General Ben Hodges, there's nothing more important than alliance cohesion, and anything that damages alliance cohesion is bad. That said, and I was a critic of the U.S. pulling out of the INF treaty, because I saw that as effectively unilateral disarmament, so to speak, because Russia was violating the treaty. But if somebody's violating a law, you don't say, okay, let's just get rid of that law then, right? This is what bothered me, and that by pulling out of INF, Russia, there is nothing to stop Russia from putting nukes in Kaliningrad or in the Western Military District, but there is everything to stop the U.S. from putting them in Europe, because we have to get the consent of the European allies, and we're not going to get it in this environment. So I felt that was kind of that was unilateral disarmament and a gift to Putin. in a lot of ways. I worry, as I know you do too, Don, as a former arms inspector, about us pulling out of and not renewing New START.
Yeah.
This I'm a little less. I tend to agree with you, Maria. I mean, I don't think we really lose a lot in this. I just wish there were more consultations with the allies on this. They seem to have been blindsided.
Yeah, two points, Brian, on that. I think Maria's right that the Open Skies Agreement is really an issue of unilateralism by the U.S., which bothers the Europeans, who see this as a limited and relatively small a way to engage the Russians in a very difficult atmosphere. But the issue of New START is interesting because people are not convinced, excuse me, that the Chinese, that the Trump administration demand to have the Chinese there is sincere and not a way just to blow up the treaty, forgive the pun. But there are very, very important verification measures in that thing that need to be preserved for whatever's down the road. That took years to develop, and whatever we do, we can't just go back to the drawing board because we're talking about cyber and high-tech weaponry and all that stuff, which needs to be preserved, whatever you think of the treaty and the limits on the warheads.
I mean, my view on nukes are that, I mean, the farther down we can bring the threshold down, the better, and the Russians are afraid of this. Because the nukes are basically the only thing that gives Russia a seat at this table. I mean, the U.S. conventional superiority is so vast with regard to Russia that nukes are the great equalizer. So I would bring down nukes to the lowest level possible to neutralize anything.
But the principle
in the Russian defense ministry of this.
The principle of on-site inspections and telemetry exchanges, those are important. As I hate to be, I'm not trying to sound naive, but those are important things to work on these problems, and you can't start again from the drawing board.
Unlike everybody else in this show, you were actually an arms inspector and involved in the negotiations on these things. Maria, last word to you. I know you wanted to say something before we wrap it up for the week.
Just a common, issue that emerges in all kinds of foreign policy when we discuss how to best deal with Putin's regime. Should you continue playing chess in the situation when your opponent essentially violate all the rules and flips the board? Right, in this situation, same, by the way, with the UN, United Nations Security Council's rules very commonly on a regular basis gets abused by Russia and also China, and don't allow, the Western countries to achieve any progress on the agenda. So in this sense, I think it's a philosophical point that we'll have to keep coming back to. The only thing I want to mention that from the Russian perspective, from Putin's perspective, I think he understands strength and force. He thinks that following the rules, I mean, from his perspective, the Western treaties are commonly the weakness that binds the partners, the European partners, but does not bind Putin himself, and hence may be abused and misused. So that's sort of long-term problem, which I agree with you, definitely is a step forward in the sense that it represents erosion of the institutional framework. But at the same time, in an effort to contain Russia, some violations of the rule I believe might be necessary.
No, you're right, Maria. This is a philosophical problem in a lot of ways. I mean, how do you deal with an opponent who does not operate in good faith? How do you constrain such an adversary with rules? How do you constrain an adversary who thinks rules are basically for sissies? Right, and real men don't follow the rules, and this is a philosophical problem. I don't have a clear answer for it, but it might be something to think about going forward. Maybe we could do a whole program on this, because Russia's use of lawfare in this sense, manipulating Western institutions and our good friends over at the Free Russia Foundation just put out a really interesting report along these lines that might be worth discussing going forward. So on that note, we shall wrap it up. It's all we have time for today on this Memorial Day weekend. I'd like to remind you have been listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, Director of the Russia Program here at CIPA. And joining me from his home in Alexandria, Virginia, where, there is an awesome old town, has been former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University, and who I imagine, just like me, hasn't had a haircut in at least 10 weeks. Also joining us from just down the street from me in Washington's beautiful DuPont Circle neighborhood is Maria Snegovaya, a fellow at SIPA's Russia program and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. I have no idea if you've gotten a haircut or not. Maria, thank you, but thank you both for an enlightening discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'd also like to thank our awesome producer, Michal Harmata, for keeping the lights on and all the complicated machines well-oiled, sanitized, and in working order throughout our discussion. I'd also like to remind you, you could subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at sipa.org. And you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Just quick programming note, coming out early next week will be a special edition of the Power Vertical podcast featuring the special envoy Leah Gabriel, the coordinator of the U.S. State Department's Global Engagement Center. Watch for that early part of next week. That's been recorded and will come out, a special edition of the podcast. And also join us again next week on the regular Power Vertical podcast. And now, as always, I leave you with the ambient sound mix our producers have created for your enjoyment.